Before the fire from heaven consumed the altar on Mount Carmel, before the black clouds ended the terrible drought in Israel, there was a young man whose destiny would change the course of an entire nation. In the fertile plains of Abel Meholah, while the sun mercilessly punished the fields, a man plowed with 12 yoke of oxen, demonstrating his extraordinary strength and determination. It was the reign of Ahab and his ungodly wife Jezebel, when idolatry had corrupted Israel. The worship of Baal dominated the hearts of the chosen people, and wickedness spread like a plague throughout the land. It was then that God, in his infinite wisdom, decided to prepare a new servant who would continue the work of the great prophet Elijah. Elisha, son of Shaphat, a prosperous farmer, worked tirelessly on his father's land. His calloused hands revealed a life dedicated to honest work, never imagining they would soon become instruments of divine miracles and wonders. While skillfully directing the 12 pairs of oxen, he saw approaching a man wrapped in a hairy mantle. It was Elijah, the feared prophet of God, who came directly from Mount Horeb with divine instructions. The prophet silently approached the young farmer and, without a word, threw his mantle over Elisha's shoulders, a symbolic gesture that would change his life forever. The contact of the mantle on his shoulders was like a lightning bolt that pierced his being, awakening in him an immediate understanding of the heavenly calling. Elisha watched Elijah walk away and felt his heart burning inside. Without hesitation, he ran after the prophet and exclaimed, "Please let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will follow you." Elijah turned and with a penetrating gaze replied, "Go back, what have I done to you?" Those words were a test. Would Elisha be able to understand the magnitude of the calling? Would he understand that there was no turning back? The young man's response showed that he had understood perfectly what God was asking of him. He returned to his field, took the yoke of oxen, and sacrificed them. With the wood from the plow, he kindled a fire and cooked the meat. After offering a farewell feast to his people, he abandoned everything to follow Elijah. As the flames consumed his past, Elisha contemplated how everything he had known was transformed into ashes. It wasn't simply a change of occupation, but a total sacrifice of his previous life. With this symbolic act, he burned the bridges that linked him to his former existence. There would be no possible return to the days of tilling the soil. "This is the day the Lord has changed my destiny," he murmured to himself while watching the last embers of his old yoke. "I will no longer sow in the earth, but in the hearts of Israel." And so, with determined steps, Elisha followed Elijah to become his servant and apprentice. For years he would observe the great prophet, learn his ways, listen to his teachings, and prepare for the moment when he would have to take his place. The humility with which he accepted to serve first before leading would reveal the heart of a true servant of God. What Israel did not know was that this simple farmer would become one of the greatest prophets of all time, performing twice as many miracles as his master Elijah, impacting kings and nations, and revealing the power and glory of God in times of darkness. The wind howled furiously over the hills of Gilgal, while Elijah, the elderly prophet, looked toward the horizon with eyes that reflected the knowledge of the inevitable. The Lord had revealed to him that his time on earth was about to end, that he would be taken to heaven without tasting death. At his side walked Elisha, faithful companion during years of shared ministry. It was the twilight of King Ahaziah's reign in Israel, and evil remained clinging to the throne like poisonous ivy. The worship of Baal, though struck by Elijah's actions on Mount Carmel, persisted in the hearts of many Israelites. God needed a new champion, someone who would continue the work of reformation and redemption. Elijah knew the time had come to test his disciples' determination. Looking at Elisha with eyes that burned like embers, he said, Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha, with unbreakable resolution in his gaze, replied, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." And so they went down together to Bethel, where the sons of the prophets approached Elisha to ask him, "Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" With a voice full of contained emotion, Elisha answered, "Yes, I know it. Keep silent." Again, Elijah tried to dismiss his disciple. "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." And again, Elisha refused with firm words, "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." The scene was repeated once more when they reached the Jordan. Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the waters, which parted, allowing them to cross on dry ground. 50 sons of the prophets watched from afar, witnesses to the divine power manifested through the elderly prophet. Having crossed the river, Elijah finally spoke clearly. "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." Without hesitating for a second, like one who had long meditated on his answer, Elisha declared, "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." Elijah, surprised by the boldness of the request, replied, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you, but if not, it shall not be so." As they continued walking and talking, suddenly a chariot of fire with horses of fire appeared and separated them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind before the astonished eyes of Elisha. The sky itself seemed to open as the elderly prophet was taken up in glory. Elisha, overwhelmed by the supernatural vision, cried out with a heart-rending voice, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." And when he could see him no more, he tore his clothes in two, a sign of deep mourning. But there was no time for prolonged lamentation. He picked up Elijah's mantle that had fallen as he was being taken up, a tangible symbol of the transfer of prophetic authority. Returning to the Jordan, Elisha faced his first test. With the mantle in his hands, he struck the waters and exclaimed, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The waters responded to the divine power, dividing to one side and the other, allowing him to cross on dry ground. The sons of the prophets who were watching from Jericho immediately understood. The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha, and they bowed to the ground before him, recognizing the authority that had now been conferred upon him. Elisha was not simply a successor by human designation, but a prophet anointed by God himself, endowed with a double portion of the Spirit that had operated in Elijah. The transition was complete. A new chapter in the history of Israel began. The mantle had changed shoulders, but the God who supported the ministry remained the same, eternal and immutable. The Lord had prepared Elisha for extraordinary times and now sent him with doubled power to face the challenges ahead. The sun mercilessly punished the dusty streets of Jericho as Elisha walked among its inhabitants, observing the paradox that the ancient city presented. Rebuilt in defiance of Joshua's curse, the city enjoyed a privileged location, but a terrible evil afflicted its inhabitants. It was the beginning of the reign of Joram, son of Ahab, over Israel. Although he had removed the statue of Baal that his father had erected, he continued practicing the sins of Jeroboam, keeping the people in idolatry. In these times of moral compromise, God needed to manifest his power to remind the people who was the true Lord. The main men of the city respectfully approached Elisha. Their faces showed the concern they had carried for years. The eldest stepped forward and with a grave voice explained, "The situation of this city is good, as my Lord can see, but the water is bad and the land is barren." Elisha listened attentively as they explained how women lost their pregnancies, crops withered prematurely, and diseases thrived among the population. The main spring that should have been a blessing for the city had become a source of suffering. With a compassionate but determined look, Elisha replied, "Bring me a new bowl and put salt in it." Confused by the simplicity of the request, but hopeful, the men quickly fulfilled his command, bringing a vessel that had never been used and filling it with pure white salt. Elisha took the bowl and asked, "Take me now to the spring of water." A procession formed as the people followed the prophet to the source of the problem. The spring flowed abundantly among the rocks, its waters clear but lethal to life. Elisha approached the edge, holding the bowl with salt, while everyone watched in expectant silence. With a deliberate movement, the prophet threw the salt into the spring and proclaimed with a powerful voice, "Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From it there shall be no more death or barrenness." The water seemed to shine for an instant when the salt made contact with it. A murmur ran through the crowd as they watched in amazement as the prophet performed such a simple act, yet loaded with divine power. There was no thunder or lightning, only the prophetic word backed by the authority of the Lord. One of the young men present, driven by curiosity, approached the water, took some with his hands, and cautiously tasted it. His face transformed into an expression of amazement and joy. "It's sweet. The water is sweet." Soon everyone began to taste the water, confirming the miracle. The waters that had been a cause of death would now bring life. God's healing power had transformed not only the water, but the entire future of the city. "And the waters have been healed to this day," murmured an old man, remembering the scriptures that related similar stories from the times of Moses. "The Lord has had mercy on us." Elisha observed the joy spreading among the population. This first public miracle after receiving Elijah's mantle was not a demonstration of power for self-glorification, but an act of compassion toward a suffering people, and also an unmistakable sign that God continued working in the midst of his people, despite the reigning idolatry. "Salt purifies and preserves," Elisha explained to the leaders surrounding him. "Just as this salt has healed the waters, God desires to heal Israel from the corruption that has infected it." News of the miracle spread quickly throughout the region. For many, it was confirmation that the spirit of Elijah truly rested upon Elisha. For others, it was an opportunity to reflect on the God who had power to transform the bitter into sweet, death into life. While the city celebrated, Elisha prepared to continue his journey. The miracle of the waters was just the beginning of his ministry. Many challenges still awaited him, but he had demonstrated that, like the waters of Jericho, God could transform what seemed irreparably damaged into a source of blessing. The heartbreaking cry of a woman broke the silence of dawn as Elisha walked through the narrow streets of Samaria. With a face marked by suffering and worn clothes that revealed her poverty, a widow prostrated herself before the prophet in desperation. It was a time of hunger and oppression in Israel. King Joram had established political alliances with pagan nations, while social justice, so emphasized by the law of Moses, was constantly ignored. The poor suffered, especially widows and orphans. The woman, between sobs, explained her terrible situation. "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord. Now the creditor has come to take my 2 children as slaves." Elisha's eyes filled with compassion as he recognized the widow of one of the sons of the prophets, faithful men who had maintained their faith in the Lord in times of general apostasy. Her husband had died leaving debts, and according to custom, creditors had the right to take the children as payment. "What shall I do for you?" asked Elisha with a soft but firm voice. "Tell me, what do you have in the house?" The woman, wiping away her tears, responded with a trembling voice, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house except a small jar of oil." Elisha nodded, understanding that God didn't need much to perform a miracle. With prophetic authority, he gave her precise instructions. Go, borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons. Then pour into all those vessels and set aside the full ones. The woman looked at the prophet with a mixture of confusion and hope. How could her small jar of oil fill multiple containers? However, faith began to spring in her heart. If the man of God said it, she must obey. "I will do as you say, my lord," she replied, bowing her head in respect. And so, that very afternoon, the widow called at her neighbors' doors, borrowing all the vessels they could share. Some looked at her strangely, others with compassion, but little by little her house filled with jars, pitchers, and containers of all sizes and shapes. When she had gathered enough, she closed the door of her humble dwelling and called her sons. "Bring me the vessels one by one." With trembling hands, she took her small jar of oil and began to pour its contents into the first container. To her amazement, the oil flowed and flowed without stopping, completely filling the first jar. With growing excitement, she asked for another and then another, while the oil continued to flow miraculously. "Mother, it's a miracle!" exclaimed one of her sons with eyes bright with amazement. "The Lord has answered our prayers," she responded as tears, now of gratitude, rolled down her cheeks. Vessel after vessel filled with the precious golden liquid, symbol of abundance and blessing. When they had finally filled all the available containers, the woman asked her son, "Bring me another vessel." "There are no more vessels, mother," replied the young man, and at that moment the oil ceased. The divine provision had been exactly enough to fill each available container, no more, no less. A divine lesson on God's precise generosity. The next morning, the widow sought Elisha again to tell him what had happened. The prophet listened attentively and finally gave her his last instruction. "Go, sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest." The miraculously obtained oil turned out to be of the highest quality, and soon the news spread through the market. Merchants and citizens came to buy, allowing her to pay all her debts and secure sustenance for herself and her children for a long time. That miracle transcended the simple act of multiplication. It was a demonstration of divine justice in the face of social injustice, a reminder that God did not forget the faithful who had served in his name, and a tangible manifestation of his providence for the vulnerable. As the woman counted the silver coins obtained, she understood a profound truth. God had not only satisfied her immediate need, but had restored her dignity and her future. Her sons, who had almost become slaves, now had hope. And throughout Samaria the story was told of the oil that never ran out, a testimony to the power of the Lord in times when many had forgotten him. The midday sun harshly punished the dusty roads of Shunem as Elisha traveled through the villages of Israel, bringing the word of the Lord to a people who had strayed from his ways. In his frequent journeys between Samaria and Mount Carmel, the prophet often passed through this prosperous locality. It was the time of Syrian influence over Israel, tumultuous times where political alliances and military tensions kept the kingdom in constant anxiety. Amid this turbulent reality, there were still families who maintained their fidelity to the Lord and respected his prophets. One of them was headed by a notable woman, known simply as the Shunammite, a woman of strong character, respected in the community, and with sufficient resources to live with dignity. Seeing Elisha pass by frequently, she insisted to her husband, "Look now, I perceive that this is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly. Please, let us make a small upper room on the wall, and let us put a bed for him there, and a table and a chair and a lampstand. So it will be, whenever he comes to us, he can turn in there." The husband, respecting his wife's vision, agreed to the request. Soon they built a simple but comfortable room on the roof of their house, thus creating a refuge for the tired prophet in his journeys. When Elisha came again to Shunem and discovered the space specially prepared for him, his heart was moved by such a display of selfless hospitality. Calling Gehazi, his servant, he asked, "Call this Shunammite woman." When she respectfully presented herself before him, Elisha expressed, "You have been concerned for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Do you want me to speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?" The woman, with notable dignity, responded, "I dwell among my own people." Her response revealed a satisfied heart, not seeking political favors or recognition. However, Gehazi, observing beyond the words, discreetly commented to Elisha, "She has no son and her husband is old." Elisha immediately understood. In that culture, not having descendants was considered a serious lack, almost a curse. Calling the woman again, he announced with a solemn voice, "About this time next year you shall embrace a son." The Shunammite, fearing to harbor a hope that could transform into painful disappointment, responded with an emotional plea, "No, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant." But the prophetic word was fulfilled exactly as Elisha had said. The following year, the Shunammite held in her arms the son she never thought she would have, a divine gift through the prophet's word. The years passed and the child grew healthy and strong, filling with joy the home that had previously lacked the sound of children's laughter. However, happiness was suddenly interrupted one morning during the harvest. The little one, who had gone out to the fields to see his father, suddenly began to cry out, "My head, my head!" The father, concerned but not suspecting the gravity of the situation, asked a servant, "Carry him to his mother." The Shunammite received her son in her arms, trying to comfort him while the pain seemed to intensify. She held him on her knees until noon, at which time the child, after a last sigh, died. The world collapsed for that mother who had waited so long to know the blessing of motherhood. With surprising strength and determination, she went up to Elisha's room, placed her son's body on the prophet's bed, and closed the door. Without revealing to anyone what had happened, not even to her husband, she asked for a servant and a donkey to go urgently to Mount Carmel, where she knew she would find Elisha. When her husband, confused, asked her, "Why are you going to him today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath," she simply replied, "It is well." But in her heart burned an unbreakable determination. The same God who had granted her an unexpected son could also restore his life. Her faith transcended pain, rising toward a hope that defied all human logic. Upon seeing her from afar, Elisha sent Gehazi with instructions. "Run now to meet her and say to her, 'Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child?'" To which she, reserving her true affliction for the prophet himself, responded, "It is well." It was only the beginning of one of the most impactful miracles in Elisha's life, a definitive proof of divine power over death itself. The wind moaned among the rocks of Mount Carmel as the Shunammite hurriedly approached Elisha. With a broken heart, but with unshakable faith, she threw herself at the prophet's feet and clung to them in desperation. It was a time when the false prophets of Baal and Asherah continued to influence the religious life of Israel, despite Elisha's efforts. True faith in the Lord needed powerful manifestations that demonstrated his supremacy over the mute idols and pagan superstitions. Gehazi approached to move her away, but Elisha stopped him. "Let her alone, for her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." Through tears, the woman finally expressed her pain with words that resonated like a reproach. "Did I ask a son of my Lord? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" Elisha immediately understood. The son who had been miraculously granted had died. Without wasting time, he ordered Gehazi, "Gird up your loins, take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not answer him. Lay my staff on the face of the child." But the Shunammite, with a determination that surprised the prophet, declared, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." Elisha recognized in those words the echo of his own response to Elijah years before, when he had refused to be separated from his master. With a sigh, he rose and followed her. Meanwhile, Gehazi had gone ahead and placed the staff on the child's face, but there was no sign of life. Returning hurriedly, he informed Elisha, who was approaching, "The child has not awakened." Upon arriving at the house, Elisha went directly to the upper room where the child's lifeless body lay. Closing the door behind him, he remained alone, facing the greatest challenge of his ministry up to that moment. The first thing he did was pray fervently to the Lord. Then, in an extraordinary act, he lay upon the child, putting his mouth on the child's mouth, his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands. And as he thus stretched himself upon him, the flesh of the child began to grow warm. He arose, walked back and forth in the room once, and then lay upon the child again. Then the miracle happened. The little one sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes, returning from the very gates of death. "Call this Shunammite," ordered Elisha to Gehazi with an emotional voice. When the mother fearfully entered the room, her eyes met the living gaze of her son. With his face illuminated by an indescribable joy, Elisha simply pronounced, "Take your son." The woman fell to the ground, kneeling in deep reverence before the prophet and before God, whose power had transcended even the barrier of death. Then she took her son in her arms and went out, carrying with her the living testimony of the Lord's power. This miracle would be remembered for generations, a convincing demonstration that the God of Israel was the Lord of life and death, far above any pagan deity. It was also a presage of future times, when the promised Messiah would perform similar acts. But Elisha's ministry continued. Shortly after, a terrible famine struck the land, and the sons of the prophets gathered with him in Gilgal. While they shared a pot of stew, one of them exclaimed in alarm, "Man of God, there is death in the pot." Someone had collected wild herbs without knowing them, including poisonous fruits that had contaminated all the food. With widespread hunger and no more provisions, the situation was desperate. Elisha, with calm authority, asked, "Bring some flour." He threw it into the pot and ordered, "Serve it to the people that they may eat." Inexplicably, the poison was neutralized, and everyone ate without suffering any harm. A simple but vital miracle for those hungry men. On another occasion, a man from Baal Shalisha brought the prophet 20 loaves of barley and fresh grain as a first fruits offering. Elisha ordered his servant, "Give it to the people that they may eat." The servant, incredulous, responded, "What? Shall I set this before 100 men? But Elisha insisted, "Give it to the people that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." And indeed, the 20 loaves multiplied by divine power fed 100 men, and food still remained, fulfilling exactly the word of the Lord. These miracles, from the resurrection of a child to the multiplication of food, consolidated Elisha's authority as a true prophet in times when divine truth was constantly questioned. Each supernatural act was a convincing testimony. The Lord continued to be the true God of Israel. The trumpets resonated in the narrow alleys of Damascus, while an imposing military procession prepared to depart for Israelite territory. At the front of the entourage, mounted on a magnificent steed, Naaman, commander of the army of Syria, concealed under his brilliant armor an affliction that consumed him day after day. It was a time of intermittent conflicts between Syria and Israel. The Arameans had carried out incursions into Israelite territory, taking captives and spoils of war. Among these captives was a young Hebrew girl who served in Naaman's house, and who would be a divine instrument for an extraordinary encounter. Naaman was a respected warrior, brave in battle, and a favorite of the king of Syria. The Lord himself had given victories to Syria through him, using him as an instrument of discipline for his rebellious people. But this powerful man suffered from leprosy, a feared disease that slowly devoured his skin and his hope. The little Hebrew maidservant, observing her master's suffering, commented one day to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would heal him of his leprosy." These words, pronounced with the simple faith of a child, reached Naaman's ears, igniting a spark of hope in his heart. Desperate to find a cure, he informed the king of Syria, who immediately drafted a letter to the king of Israel and sent Naaman with sumptuous gifts, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Upon reading the letter that said, "I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy," the king of Israel tore his clothes in anguish and exclaimed, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." When Elisha heard of this, he sent a message to the king, "Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Naaman, with all his retinue, his chariots and horses, arrived at the door of Elisha's house. He expected a reception according to his rank, perhaps an elaborate healing ritual performed by the famous prophet. However, Elisha did not even come out to meet him. Instead, he sent a messenger with a simple instruction: "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." The general's pride inflamed at what he considered an unforgivable slight. "Indeed," I said to myself, "he will surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place, and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" And so, enraged, he turned to return to his land. But his servants, showing wisdom and loyalty, approached to reason with him. "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then, when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" These words penetrated the warrior's armor of pride. With renewed humility, Naaman went down to the Jordan River and immersed himself 7 times, following exactly the prophet's instructions. At the 7th dip, his flesh was restored like that of a little child. The leprosy had completely disappeared. With a heart overflowing with gratitude, Naaman returned with all his retinue to Elisha's house. This time, the prophet came out to meet him. With an emotional voice, the general declared, "Indeed, now I know that there is no God in all the earth, except in Israel. Now therefore please take a gift from your servant." But Elisha, with unbreakable firmness, responded, "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing." Despite Naaman's insistence, the prophet remained immovable. It was not for gifts that God healed, but by his grace and for the glory of his name. Elisha knew that accepting payment could give the impression that divine power could be purchased with riches. Naaman, transformed not only physically, but also spiritually, made a final request. "Then please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth, for your servant will no longer offer either burnt offering or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord." Elisha granted him leave to depart in peace, blessing his new commitment to the true God. Thus, that powerful foreign general returned to his land not only healed of leprosy, but converted into a worshipper of the God of Israel. What no one suspected was that Gehazi, Elisha's servant, observed with covetous eyes the treasures that Naaman was taking back. Greed would germinate in his heart, leading him to betray his master's principles and suffer devastating consequences for his deception. Meanwhile, the story of the healing of the Syrian general spread throughout the region, an undeniable testimony to the power of the Lord beyond the borders of Israel. A foreigner had found physical and spiritual healing, while many Israelites remained blind in their idolatry. The Jordan River flowed serenely, its greenish waters reflecting the last rays of the setting sun, while a group of the sons of the prophets worked diligently on its bank. They were cutting trees to build a new dwelling place, for their community had grown under Elisha's tutelage. It was a time when the schools of the prophets were flourishing again. Despite the persistent idolatry in Israel, these groups of dedicated men preserved the true worship of the Lord and diligently studied the law. Elisha had revitalized these communities, strengthening spiritual resistance against religious corruption. One of the young prophets, while cutting down a tree by the river, suffered an accident. The head of the axe he was using came off the handle and fell directly into the water. Desperate, he cried out to Elisha, "Alas, master, it was borrowed." In those times of scarcity, an iron tool was extremely valuable, and losing a borrowed one meant an impossible debt for a humble apprentice prophet. Elisha, understanding the young man's anguish, asked, "Where did it fall?" When they showed him the place, Elisha cut off a stick, threw it in there, and something extraordinary happened. The iron axe head floated on the surface of the water, defying all natural laws. "Pick it up," Elisha simply said. The young man, amazed, extended his hand and recovered the tool. An apparently small miracle, but one that demonstrated how God's power manifested even in the daily needs of his faithful servants. Meanwhile, tension between Israel and Syria increased. The king of Syria, frustrated by his military failures against Israel, summoned his officers and accused them. "Will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel?" One of his servants answered, "None, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom." Indeed, God revealed to Elisha the Syrian war plans, allowing him to warn the king of Israel about each planned ambush. Furious upon discovering the source of his failures, the king of Syria ordered, "Go and find out where he is, that I may send and capture him." Upon receiving reports that Elisha was in Dothan, he sent there a powerful army with horses and chariots, which surrounded the city during the night. At dawn, Elisha's servant went out and saw with horror the military siege. Terrified, he exclaimed, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" Elisha, with calm confidence, replied, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Then raising a prayer, he asked, "O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see." The Lord opened the young man's eyes, and then he beheld an amazing vision. The mountain around Elisha was full of horses and chariots of fire, a celestial army invisible to human eyes, but more powerful than any earthly force. When the Syrians came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, "Please strike this people with blindness." Immediately the enemy soldiers were affected by a strange visual confusion. Elisha approached them and said, "This is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek." Without recognizing the prophet, they docilely followed him to Samaria, the capital of the kingdom of Israel, walking directly into enemy territory. Once inside the city, Elisha asked the Lord to open the eyes of the Syrians. When they recovered their vision, they discovered with horror that they were surrounded by Israelite forces. The king of Israel, seeing them at his mercy, anxiously asked Elisha, "Shall I kill them, my father?" The prophet's response revealed the compassionate character of his ministry. "You shall not kill them. Would you kill those whom you have taken captive with your sword and your bow? Set food and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master." Following this surprising advice, the king of Israel prepared a great feast for his captured enemies. After eating and drinking, he sent them back to their lord. This demonstration of mercy had a profound effect. The marauding bands of Syria stopped invading the land of Israel for a time. The God who makes iron float is the same who surrounds us with invisible armies, Elisha taught his disciples. His power manifests itself in both small and great things, and his protection is upon those who serve him. These two extraordinary episodes left profound lessons. Nothing escapes God's power, from a lost axe to entire armies, and sometimes the greatest demonstration of divine power is not in the destruction of enemies, but in the mercy that can transform hearts. An ominous silence extended through the empty streets of Samaria, while hunger devoured the entrails of the besieged city. Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, had gathered his entire army and laid siege to the capital of Israel, cutting off any food supply. It was the reign of Joram, son of Ahab, a time when Israel continued in its religious apostasy despite multiple calls to repentance. Idols remained, and the worship of the Lord was mixed with pagan practices, provoking divine judgment through enemy nations. The situation inside Samaria had become desperate. Hunger reached unimaginable levels, to the point that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver and a fourth of a cab of dove droppings for 5 shekels. People wandered the streets with cadaverous faces, looking for anything edible. One day, as King Joram walked along the walls of the city supervising the defenses, a woman cried out from below, "Help, my lord, O king." The king, irritated by his own impotence, responded, "If the Lord does not help you, where can I find help for you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?" However, he asked, "What is troubling you?" The woman then related a horrifying story. "This woman said to me, 'Give your son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. And the next day I said to her, 'Give your son, that we may eat him.' But she has hidden her son." Upon hearing such an atrocity, the king tore his clothes. Those who were near could see that he wore sackcloth under his royal robes, a sign of personal mourning for the situation of his people. But his heart, instead of turning to God in repentance, filled with anger against Elisha. "God, do so to me, and more also, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat remains on him today," he swore with rage. Meanwhile, Elisha was sitting in his house with the elders of Israel. Before the king's messenger arrived, the prophet had already been warned by the Spirit of God. "Do you see how this son of a murderer has sent someone to take away my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold him fast at the door. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" Indeed, behind the messenger came the king himself, who upon arriving exclaimed in desperation, "This calamity is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" Elisha, instead of defending himself, pronounced a surprising prophecy. "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time a sea of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, at the gate of Samaria." The officer on whose arm the king leaned responded with skepticism. "Look, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" Elisha, with a severe look, replied to him, "In fact, you shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it." That same night, outside the walls of the city, something extraordinary happened. 4 leprous men who survived at the gate of the city reasoned among themselves, "Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, 'We will enter the city,' the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come, let us surrender to the army of the Syrians. If they keep us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall only die." At twilight they rose to go to the Syrian camp. To their amazement, upon arriving, they found that there was no one. The Lord had caused the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army, making them believe that the king of Israel had hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack them. In their panic, the Syrians had fled, abandoning everything: tents, horses, donkeys, and provisions. The lepers entered a tent, ate, drank, and took silver, gold, and clothing. After hiding their plunder, they reflected, "We are not doing right. This day is a day of good news, and we remain silent." They hurriedly returned to the city and told what had happened to the gatekeepers, who brought the news to the royal palace. The king, suspecting a trap, sent scouts who confirmed the Syrians' flight and the road full of garments and equipment they had thrown away in their haste. The hungry people then went out and plundered the Syrian camp. Elisha's prophecy was fulfilled exactly. A seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel. And that skeptical officer, whom the king had put in charge of the gate, was trampled by the people in their desperation to obtain food, and died without tasting the sudden abundance, just as Elisha had predicted. This dramatic episode again demonstrated that the word of the Lord pronounced by his prophet was infallible. In a matter of hours, the situation had gone from the most terrible famine to abundance, from despair to hope. God had intervened supernaturally, not through armies or conventional battles, but by making a heavenly noise be heard that unleashed terror among the Syrians. For the people of Israel, it was another opportunity to recognize God's hand and turn to him, abandoning their mute idols that could not save them from hunger or from their enemies. However, as so many times in their history, the lesson would be forgotten too soon. The dust of the road swirled under the hooves of the swift horse as a young disciple of the prophets galloped toward Ramoth-Gilead. In his hand, he carried a flask of oil, and in his mind, Elisha's precise instructions for a mission that would change the course of 2 nations. It was the time designated by God for the final judgment on the house of Ahab. Years before, Elijah had received the divine mandate to anoint Jehu as king, to execute the Lord's vengeance against the dynasty that had introduced Baal worship in Israel. Now through Elisha, that prophetic word would be fulfilled. When you arrive, look for Jehu the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi. Elisha had instructed him. Take him aside, pour the oil on his head, and say, "Thus says the Lord, I have anointed you king over Israel." Then open the door and flee without delay. The young prophet found Jehu sitting with the captains of the army. With a trembling but determined voice, he announced, "I have a message for you, O captain." "For which one of us all?" asked Jehu. "For you, O captain," replied the young man. Once in private, the messenger poured the oil on Jehu's head and pronounced the divine decree. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I have anointed you king over the people of the Lord, over Israel. You shall strike down the house of Ahab your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel." After transmitting the detailed judgment on the house of Ahab, the young man opened the door and fled, leaving Jehu alone with the shocking revelation. When Jehu returned to the other officers, they asked, "Is all well? Why did this madman come to you?" Jehu tried to evade the question, but at the insistence of his companions, he finally revealed, "He spoke to me like this, saying, 'Thus says the Lord, I have anointed you king over Israel.'" The officers, recognizing the divine intervention, reacted immediately. They took their garments and put them under Jehu on the top of the steps, blew the trumpet, and proclaimed, "Jehu is king." Without wasting time, Jehu organized a conspiracy against Joram, king of Israel, who was recovering from battle wounds in Jezreel. Mounting his chariot, he departed with determination to fulfill the divine mandate. The watchman of Jezreel spotted the company approaching and warned the king, "I see a company, and the driving is like the driving of Jehu the son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously." Joram went out in his chariot to meet Jehu, asking, "Is it peace, Jehu?" The response was blunt. "What peace, as long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcraft are so many?" At that moment, Joram tried to flee, shouting, "Treachery!" But Jehu drew his bow and shot an arrow that pierced the king's heart. His body was thrown in the vineyard of Naboth, fulfilling the prophetic word about the dynasty of Ahab. Jehu continued to the palace, where Jezebel, the queen mother, had adorned herself and painted her eyes, expecting his arrival. From the window, she provoked him. "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" Jehu ordered the eunuchs to throw her out the window. Her blood spattered on the wall and the horses trampled her. When they later sent to recover her body for burial, they found only the skull, the feet, and the palms of her hands. Elijah's prophecy had been fulfilled in its entirety. Dogs ate Jezebel's flesh in Jezreel. While these dramatic events unfolded, Elisha continued his ministry, training new prophets and keeping true worship alive in tumultuous times. His influence extended beyond Israel, reaching Syria and other neighboring kingdoms. The numerous miracles he performed confirmed his authority as God's spokesman. Years later, when Elisha was old and sick unto death, King Joash of Israel came down to visit him, recognizing his importance to the nation. Upon seeing him, the king wept over his face, saying, "O my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." Elisha, despite his weakness, had strength for a final prophecy. He asked the king to take a bow and arrows, and placing his own hands on those of the monarch, he had him shoot an arrow through the window toward the east, declaring, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance and the arrow of deliverance from Syria, for you must strike the Syrians at Aphek till you have destroyed them." Then he ordered the king to strike the ground with the arrows. Joash did so 3 times and stopped. Elisha, annoyed, exclaimed, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck Syria till you had destroyed it. But now you will strike Syria only 3 times." Shortly afterward, Elisha died and was buried. But even in death, God's power would continue to manifest through him in an extraordinary way. During an incursion by Moabite bands, some men who were burying a dead man, upon seeing the enemies approaching, hastily threw the corpse into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched the prophet's bones, something amazing happened. The man revived and stood on his feet. Elisha's last miracle, performed after his death, testified that God's power transcends even the final barrier of human existence. Elisha's legacy endured for generations. His miracles, prophecies, and teachings were transmitted orally and then collected in the scriptures. During 60 years of ministry, he had been God's instrument to maintain true faith in times of widespread apostasy. Elisha not only continued Elijah's work, but multiplied it. The wise taught future generations. He received a double portion of his master's spirit and performed twice as many miracles, demonstrating that the Lord is the only true God. The prophet, who began as a simple farmer, ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen, had impacted kings, nations, and entire peoples. His miracles ranged from the multiplication of oil for a widow to the resurrection of the dead, from the healing of a foreign general to the prediction of political changes that would alter the map of the region. But beyond the supernatural wonders, Elisha's true impact resided in his unbreakable fidelity to the Lord and in his determination to keep true faith alive in a hostile environment. Like a beacon in times of spiritual darkness, he illuminated the way for others to find the true God. And while the nations of Israel and Judah continued their complicated history, the memory of the man who made iron float, healed a foreign leper, and multiplied food for the hungry would continue inspiring generations of believers, an eternal testimony to the power and mercy of the God whom he served so faithfully until his last breath.